I've been wanting to make an update video about the e-208 since my last video from about 2 years ago didn't end on a particularly positive note. I was still dealing with some reliability issues, in that case the second OBC, and I was driving around without an OBC and having to use public DC chargers to recharge the car. And just to give a quick update what happened in that case, Stellantis did end up paying for the second OBC, and it was replaced shortly after I made that video. And so in the end, Stellantis did end up paying for most of the reliability issues with this car and the repairs. They paid for all the parts which were replaced and the labour to replace those parts, but the CCU failure, which needed a software update and thus was just a labour cost, they didn't end up paying for that, and that was €300 out of pocket. So to go over the car, it's got 70,000 miles or 110,000 kilometers on it at the moment. To give a brief recap of the issues I've had with this car, which were also listed in the previous video where I voiced some of my frustrations with this car and its reliability. To start off, when the car was almost brand new, it had the brake pedal micro switch fail at around 20,000 kilometers, which had some effects on the safety assistance systems, which didn't work properly. Then at around 30,000 kilometers, the first OBC failed, so that meant I couldn't charge using AC at home. I could only use DC public chargers, rapid chargers. Following that, around 37,000 kilometers, there was a high voltage isolation fault, which ended up being the charging port assembly that was then replaced. Following that, at around 70,000 kilometers, the AC compressor failed, which also had some negative effects on the battery cooling system, because this car can offload some of the heat of the battery cooling loop into the AC circuit, which is then dissipated by the AC system. So that led to the car overheating while fast charging, although thankfully it didn't cause any permanent issues with the car. Following that, the car had an issue with its charge control unit, so the car would no longer charge at DC rapid charging stations. Following that, at around 80,000 kilometers, the second OBC failed, which was then replaced around 3 months later because of parts shortage, which obviously left the car driving without an OBC, so I could only charge at DC rapid charging stations with that failure. And that was the last failure with this car around 2 years ago. Regarding the battery, all the cells are well balanced, so I don't see any sort of cell failure, so the battery seems to be in overall good health. And so in general, since that second OBC was replaced, it has been quite problem free. It's only driven about 25,000 kilometers since then. In those 2 years, the OBC has been fine, although it hasn't been the longest driven OBC on this car since the second OBC, which did fail as well. That lasted about 2 years and 50,000 kilometers. So it's perhaps a little too early to say whether this one will last longer. But anecdotally, going off the reports from the Jeep Avenger, that doesn't seem to have the OBC issue. If it has been replaced with that updated version of the OBC, it shouldn't cause any more problems. And so to go over the other aspects of this car, as far as battery degradation, the state of health reported by the car's BMS isn't really trustworthy. So in this case, it's reporting 102.5% state of health. Obviously above 100% is not possible. But going off the reported full charge capacity of 39.8 kilowatt hours, that would give a degradation of around 11.5% over the original 45 kilowatt hour net capacity. So that's really not a bad figure, although we have been experiencing some quite Arctic conditions at the moment, and temperature can affect how the BMS reports full charge capacity, especially in the Stellantis cars. So, of course, the colder the weather, the lower the voltage reported, and therefore also the lower capacity that the BMS estimates. I would say that on a conservative estimate, it's around 11.5, although in actuality I think it would be around 8 to 10%, tending towards the lower value of 8%. Of course, to use that full charge capacity and be able to get any sort of viable or authoritative information out of it, you really want to do that in summer, around 25 degrees internal temperature for the battery. So since it's so cold, it's around 2 degrees with minus temperatures overnight, that 39.8 kilowatt hour value is probably quite conservative. Going on to the sort of everyday use of this car, real world range is around 250 kilometers in normal weather. It's about 200 in the winter, so when it gets very cold, and 300 kilometers at a stretch if you're really hypermiling it in the winter. So, but that's an issue of the consumption of this car, which has always tended to be quite high for such a small car, rather than degradation, because as I've mentioned, that the degradation is really not that bad, especially given the fact that this is an older car coming up on over 5 years now, and it's obviously high mileage, so let's say 8 to 11.5% degradation is really to be expected, and it hasn't really moved too much in the last 2 years from when it was at 7% in the last video which I shot with this car. So overall, excluding the reliability issues, I'm still happy with the car. The range, it has always been a weak point of this car. Never had the longest range. It's never really been able to achieve that 350 kilometer WLTP value. The best I've been able to do is 330 kilometers, and that was really hypermiling it in summer. So range has always been a weak point. That's not to be attributed to battery degradation, but rather to the high consumption of this car. Especially heating consumption in winter can be high, and that does compound over the time that you drive the car, in the sense that if you drive the car slowly in town and you have a lower average speed, then your range is going to be hit harder by that heating consumption, which is constantly sapping power from the battery. Regarding other costs, so the typical sort of wear and tear items on this car, it has gone through 3 sets of tyres, especially the front tyres. They do get used up rather fast, owing to the fact that this car is front wheel drive. It's electric, so it hasn't got as much weight on the front wheels, and that does tend to exacerbate front tyre wear and tear, so those front tyres have been replaced rather often. So regarding the tyres, the first set were the Michelin e-Primacy EV specific tyres that came with the car. Overall, they're not great in the wet, as corroborated by tests by the ADAC compared to the regular Primacy 4s. They're a little bit lower tread, so they tend to wear much faster than say an all-weather tyre, so those only lasted around 35 to 40,000 kilometers, if I remember correctly. Then the car had a set of winter tyres, which also, obviously winter tyres being a softer compound, they did get used up again around the 35 to 40,000 kilometer mark. And the car currently sits on Michelin Cross Climate 2s, which are a decent hard-wearing tyre. In terms of other issues with the car, just the normal wear and tear items. So it did have a sway bar link that was replaced, and because the rubber had perished and it was making a bit of a noise, which you could hear in the last video. So now that's been replaced, and the car is in decent condition. So to end the video on whether I would recommend this car, well, it's still going to be a no for me. I mean, these early e-208s, they had a lot of problems, the AC compressor, the 11 kilowatt OBC, the ABS wiring harness, which are all relatively common occurrences with this car. So my advice would be really to avoid these early models. You know, you really have to look for one that's really been sorted, that's had those problematic components replaced with the updated versions. You know, if you're just looking at one that's had it replaced with the same OBC that's going to break down, that's no good. You know, you know, you're going to be looking for a car that's had those things sorted after 2023, and it's like a needle in the haystack. You know, these are already some of the cheapest EVs on the used market, so you might as well go and look for one which didn't have those problems in the first place. That's going to be one 2023 and later. So my advice is just to stay away from these early models. The price difference, it isn't going to be so drastic between 2020 to 2022 model and then a 2023 and later. So really go and look for those. Maybe even look for the ones with slightly longer range that had the bigger battery and the slightly more powerful motor. That would be really the ideal choice. Regarding the OBC, that has now been confirmed as a rather common issue on these cars by a Dutch auto magazine that did an investigative report on the Stellantis Male OBC, and I will link that in the description below, because it gives you a good overview of the models and years which are affected by this OBC issue, and of course those are the models you probably want to avoid.